Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 6 cheat sheet, and this video is supported by Fantasy Football Hub. It's a fantastic tool that will actually help increase your rank as an FPL manager. There's a lot of projected points on offer, advanced data stats as well, which is very useful for the cheat sheet series too. And on top of that, you can actually have a lot of other tools like suggested transfers and things like that to help specifically for your team to help win your mini league and get your money back as well, which is an offer that Fantasy Football Hub have. They also have a 50% off discount up until the end of the month. So have a look at Fantasy Football Hub if you do want to have a boost towards your rank and your achievement in FPL. Now, for the Game Week 6 cheat sheet, what I'll say is that this is a window where a lot of people are considering the Game Week 6 wildcard. I myself am doing so. So when I look at the cheat sheet, I don't think there's anything specific that changes in terms of the series that I'm actually going to be providing to you. It's just going to be, once again, looking ahead towards the short term specifically, but then also keeping an open eye towards, of course, a medium to long term. This is how the series always works. So whilst you might see only 3 fixtures here, I'm definitely taking into context at least the next 5 fixtures on top of that. So around a 8-game week scenario. On top of that, we're looking at the underlying stats of previous seasons and this season, looking at team strength models as well, to sort of update my understanding of the game. And of course, as I watch most of the games in the Premier League, plus sort of follow most of the press conferences of managers, trying to impute some of the tactical insights that I'm getting from the games. As far as the cheat sheet goes, we start with the midfield this week. Rodgers moves back up. And part of this is because I did sound a little bit of concern last week as to his minutes. If, let's say, there was an instance where John Duran is increasingly finding himself within the starting 11, and that might have a knock-on impact on Rodgers. I do feel like that's not going to happen. Rodgers' minutes have been incredible. Honestly, 95 minutes played per game so far, and he really was the shift, I suppose, in that victory versus Wolves as well. That is so significant. He also ended up getting 10 points because of the sort of review or re-review of the bonus point system, which meant that he actually finished the game with 10 points, so his first double-digit haul of this season. And I'm not just reacting to, him doing well within this game, but specifically talking about things like the John McGinn injury. That is going to be impactful in the sense that Aston Villa will just need more bodies within the team. He clearly is extremely preferred by Unai Emery. And for that reason, with Aston Villa still having a very strong run of games, he still deserves a rise back for the cheat sheet. I probably moved a little bit too preemptively to drop him last week, but that's that. As far as Dibbling, he gets an introduction to the cheat sheet because he's a 4.5 asset. He's probably the best 4.5 midfielder in the game. And I think what's nice about Dibbling is, when you're looking at a 4.5, someone like Winks is someone that you would probably never, ever play. But if someone like Tyler Dibbling, in the sort of offensive role that he plays for Southampton, is actually going to start and play 75, maybe even 80 minutes a game, he actually is very realistically someone who you can actually rotate a little bit with. I wouldn't try and maximize it too much. If you have Dibbling in your team, I would love you to have still 7 attackers outside of Dibbling, but he does provide you some serious value. So as opposed to someone like Winks in the past, who was basically just a pure sort of 1 point, 2 point merchant, I do think Dibbling actually has an insane amount of value within the game, despite not actually having penalties, but just simply because of, with Southampton, I think one of the concerns always with Russell Martin so far this season is going to be how quickly this minutes change, how often and how impactful you can be within the team, and how quickly that changes so far. We've seen that with, Adam Armstrong quickly getting shifted out of the sort of preferred team, and even arguably Ben Burns and Diaz. So I do think that whilst Dibbling is comfortably maybe their best attacker now, that might not be the same landscape in 3 to 4 game weeks. However, he's just going to be extreme value for 4.5. With Adama, he stays where he is. With Carvalho, he actually played around 86 minutes for Brentford. We saw Kevin Schade actually get sort of sat on the bench because he probably played 90 minutes within the cup, which was probably a bit too much for him, sort of asking him to kind of meet the turnover there. Now, the key thing with Brentford is that we always do tend to see slightly different formations and lineups for them. And clearly, without a true center forward within the team now, we expected Schade to get more minutes, but it seems like, someone like Thomas Frank is comfortable not actually having to start Schade every game, which obviously has a huge negative impact on Schade and his expected minutes. But it's actually very nice for someone like Carvalho who can definitely step in here. I still think that I would like to assess his minutes going forwards as opposed to taking the punt into moving for Carvalho, because I don't think that simply looking at the 86 minutes in the previous match is a good indication of his minutes for the future. He's clearly played a lot of games off the bench. I imagine that his role in the team could be quite diminished, because if you look at someone like Damsgaard in the past, someone they actually spent a decent amount of money on too. I mean, it's not like he's always played a consistent amount of minutes and been a starter within the team. So I do think like that is a gradual process, and clearly they have different players that they can play now within sort of wide positions too. So it doesn't necessarily mean that Carvalho, I think, is immediately a great pick. With Amad Diallo, the Rashford substitution was a bit of a shock to me. I actually had a pretty big sort of confidence boost in terms of Rashford and his just general form recently. But with Ten Hag sort of changing things up once again, with Højlund coming back into the team, arguably there's just going to be less positions and or rather more players to compete in less positions for Man United. And the knock-on impact is, I think, even though Ahmad has actually had good minutes, with exception to, I think, a benching versus Brighton so far, that he's probably still going to be someone prone to benchings within the future. And I don't think that there's really a need to sort of spend that additional surplus value on someone like Amad Diallo for now, even though he's actually been playing reasonably well for Man United. In the 5.x sort of or 5.5 plus position, we actually have McNeil as well. So what I like about McNeil is that he's actually someone who is your classic Andreas type option, someone who, you know, will sometimes get involved in open play, but for the most part, a lot of his value does come from set pieces. And of course, there are going to be games like, I don't know if you remember when let's say McNeil actually scored, I believe, a hat-trick or at least a brace versus the De Zerbi Brighton team. But of course, at times, you know, McNeil for the most part is actually just a very classic FPL asset who is a bit dull and I think a bit flat. Underlying stats so far this season have been good, but that's a smaller sample size. I think he definitely gets a rise with the run of games for Everton being so pure, but do I actually see him as basically an extremely consistent good option? I still don't think that that's necessarily the case. So that's why I'm a little bit lower on someone like McNeil for now, because I just think that looking at his sort of historic underlying stats, that it's very likely he's not going to sort of maintain this extremely hot start to the season with his underlying numbers. As far as someone like Smith Rowe, he's still where he is at, and he's obviously the highest performing 5.x player, probably behind or maybe a little bit ahead of Semenyo for now. But Semenyo is the pick that I still think that for the run of games ahead is still more interesting, because game week 6 and 7 are so good for Semenyo. And yes, game weeks 8, 9, and 10 are actually really poor for Semenyo, but still, he's actually a pick that I would consider a bit of a talisman. So for example, while Smith Rowe is getting into slightly tougher fixtures, even though he played 83 minutes in game week 5, I do think that his minutes are a little bit more variable compared to Semenyo. Semenyo was indeed subbed off at 69 minutes versus Liverpool, but the difference that I would say to try contextualize that is I do think that was very much game state related, right? Semenyo was playing with a Bournemouth team that probably were quite hapless versus Liverpool. I think it did make sense to sub him off to sort of honestly salvage him for a future game where, you know, there is a more realistic sort of way to come back. Now, of course, Bournemouth did actually do exactly that versus Everton when they were 2-0 down previously, but you get the point. I think different sort of team strengths sort of come into play there. Mavididi also gets an introduction into the cheat sheet. He was actually one of the picks that we sort of signaled as quite interesting at the start of the season, mostly because of the potential centre forward and pen share. Now it seems like Steve Cooper has sort of, I guess, learned his lesson in terms of who his key attackers are. We thought that Mavididi would, at the very least, at the start of the season, just play left wing for the team. He's been playing really well for Leicester for the last 2 games. He scored 2 goals, of course, and that's a huge signal as usual. But once again, if you're one of the main producers for the team and one of the main outlets for the team, especially a team that is as weak as Leicester as they are now, I think the same situation really applies to someone like Dibbling, where it's hard to believe that their minutes for the short term will actually be poor after actually showing some sort of production for the team when there's been no production whatsoever. So Mavididi definitely, I think, is someone who's going to enjoy the next run of games and also get better minutes, which is a huge boost. As far as Shadi Minte, they get these drops. Minte ultimately, you know, I probably think that he could be removed from the cheat sheet as well. It's not the case that I think Minte will sort of become a permanent bench option, but clearly with the 2 fixtures, I think a lot of people were targeting game weeks 4 and 5 specifically. Even myself, I was probably more enthused about João Pedro over game weeks 4 and 5, and I've come off probably missing out on a Konsa 9-pointer instead, and, you know, not gotten any good auto subs in game week 4. So that's life, and that happens sometimes with sort of trying to target specific fixture runs for a team. But that's why Minte definitely gets a drop. As far as Tielemans, I still think, as I said, the value is through someone like Rodgers, but Tielemans is still definitely a very strong, stable FPL. And he does, once again, sort of remind me of someone like McNeil. Obviously, he plays a bit deeper at times. McNeil has a variety of positions that he can sort of play in. We've seen him play left back in the past, but generally, of course, a lot of the value does come from set pieces, and he's much less of an open play threat, generally speaking. In the 6.x position, we don't have too many changes here, but Savio gets a massive rise within the cheat sheet. And part of this is because I really think that when you once again try to think about how Man City will line up in the best way possible this season, the reality I would say is that Savio is an absolutely nailed right winger within the team. Yes, of course, we have seen 45-minute substitutions for Foden so far, but I think the key difference that I would say is that Foden is someone who really should be playing inside. So when we, for example, saw the substitution in the Champions League, what you saw was Bernardo Silva actually playing wide right and, effectively sort of playing that role in the right wing to a much less sort of efficacious capacity as Savio. Whereas I think clearly the system this season is having very designated true wingers playing left wing and right wing, stretching the field, and also being able to take on their defenders and sort of push into positions, into cutback positions as well. That's a lot more effective than what was in the past. Basically, Foden or Bernardo alternating inside and right wing and not exactly utilizing the right sort of half spaces effectively, or even really the touchline, I would say. So Savio for me is someone who's very important to Man City. The reason why I've given him rise is I do have that sort of confidence in his minutes. Whilst you go for Savio, I think you have to be 100% open to the idea that he's going to be benched, or rather, capable of being benched once again at 45 minutes, just because there are 4 players in the interior positions. KDB will come back for Game Week 6. And you've got Gundo, Bernardo, Foden also competing for those spots. So where else can their minutes go? Probably to right wing, but I think Savio will actually continue to start for the future. So you'll probably see a mix of 45, 75, and 90 for Savio, which means that maybe with an average of around 75 minutes per game, he's actually still a very elite pick. So that's sort of where I'm sat with Savio, considering that Man City actually have a generally good run of games for the next 4 to 5 game weeks. As far as someone like Kudus, I really have to say that West Ham have looked absolutely awful so far. And I gave Kudus and Bowen a rise, but generally I think that West Ham have looked like one of the most horrendous teams within the league so far. The performance versus Chelsea was especially poor, but when you look at the underlying stats for Kudus and Bowen, it's actually shocking to believe that so far these players, even though the fixtures have been tough, have played significantly worse than what you'd expect from, let's say, the standards of last season. And Bowen's probably the one that's more aggressively felt, considering that he's always had really good open play underlying numbers. And we usually associate someone like Moyes with being a little bit more of a defensive manager. So this is already really poor as things stand. I still think that Kudus and Bowen are very good players, in the sense that if you showed me that West Ham lineup of players, would I think that there's going to be better production and general performance from the team? Yes, of course. But I think even early on within the start of the season, there's something not quite right within the team. I don't exactly know what it is. Maybe it'll actually get adjusted within 1 to 2 game weeks time. But I think that because the fixture run isn't amazing, because it's a little bit middling, I thought that they'd probably kick on and it would take a little bit of time to sort of develop in the structure. But just generally, the performance has been poor. I'm struggling to believe that there's going to be a huge U-turn around the corner, which is why Kudus drops. Sobo's minutes are taking a little bit of a beating, and that's because we saw, reduced minutes within the previous Premier League match versus Bournemouth. And part of that is because I think he's been poor in some games, but also he's simply been the player playing that sort of 10 position and also deep lying progressor type position for the last 5 game weeks now, including playing Champions League matches. He played 95, for example, versus Milan. For the previous 4 games to game week 5, he played the full extent of those games as well. So the fact that his minutes have dropped, the fact that Liverpool's fixture run is getting a little bit worse, I do think Sobo has to drop. And that's that. With Mitoma, same sort of logic applying to the fixture run here, specifically for Bournemouth, or for Brighton rather. No additional sort of value from set pieces and things like that, just mean that at this sort of price point, Mitoma does drop. With Rashford, that sub definitely came out of nowhere for me, and he gets a drop. And you're starting to see that we are slowly losing a lot of good value players due to minutes, due to fixtures, and due to a multitude of other things. So actually, I think the amount of green or even yellow options within the game right now are comfortably reducing, which is not great. As far as, let's say, the likes of Luis Diaz, look, his minutes so far haven't been perfect. And I think that it's very plausible we can still see something like a Gakpo start within the Premier League, but it's more than likely that he'll continue staying. I've taken Jota out of the cheat sheet immediately, but for Luis Diaz specifically, I do think that he is someone who's played extremely well so far, but he's still overperforming a little bit. Yes, the underlying stats for Luis Diaz have been much better than under Klopp, but to also expect him to sort of maintain this level of production, and whilst you contextualize that with the fact that he's only playing 70 minutes a game as opposed to 90 when you're looking at per 90 stats, I do think that people need to temper their expectations a little bit with Luis Diaz, particularly since the next 3-4 fixtures are not going to be as exclusively good as they were from game weeks 1 to 5 specifically. Game week 6, though, is still very, very good for Liverpool, but I don't think there's a need to sort of yo-yo around because Luis Diaz is playing that well. I have to sort of try and look ahead towards the fixtures and still contextualize that Luis Diaz is probably not going to be the best performing midfielder in the game for the next 3 to 4 game weeks, which is why he is still a yellow pick. As far as Maddison, he's playing well, but we did sort of project that too. So I think he's at a comfortable position where I think he's sort of correctly rated. We also have Tottenham with, you know, up and down fixtures, I would say up until game week 8/10. Those are the windows where I would say there are clear hop on points for some of the Tottenham assets, particularly some of the sort of tertiary or even like sort of fourth best assets within the team. I still think that for Son and Solanke, and you'll see later on, or even some of the defenders, that they're probably very comfortably within the top of my list for me, but that's that. With Bruno, he's one of those picks where I know a lot of people will just be upset about the fact that he's even in the cheat sheet, but the reality is from the production that he's done so far, he is clearly not someone who is exclusively tied to being able to get FPL points through penalties. Has he been unclinical this season? Yes. Has he been unfortunate this season? Like, for example, the missed assist for Garnacho versus Brighton? Yes. Do Bruno Fernandes owners like myself, do we deserve more points? Probably not in terms of outcomes. Like, I think it's been unfortunate. He's definitely been points dodging, and that's that in FPL. But with someone who plays 95 minutes a game, even if you have certain thoughts about Man United and where they are as a team compared to, let's say, many, many years ago, the reality is he still is sort of showing that underlying production that's good enough, and he has the sort of hidden intangibles that's good enough to make him still very much comfortably a good FPL asset. I would actually make him green, but I know a lot of people will get upset by the time they actually reach this segment. But that's that. He's probably the one pick that I feel pressured, I guess, to sort of keep yellow, because a lot of people can't understand why I still like Bruno as an FPL pick, but it comes down to your personal opinion as well. Because I understand a lot of people do sort of see the blend between form and fixtures, and someone like Bruno is tough to sort of understand, I guess, as an FPL asset so far. Anyways, in terms of Foden KDB, Foden was subbed versus Arsenal, but I feel like he is slowly building more fitness, and I don't really feel the need to necessarily push him down with KDB. Maybe he needs more time to rest, but I've preemptively dropped him. I also think that sort of at this price point, I'm not sure if a lot of people would be wanting to go into KDB. I also think, once again, going back to sort of age, we definitely have a situation where sort of at his age with recurring injuries as well, that we can be fair and say that I think our initial caution with KDB was there, and it was sort of relevant in terms of, unfortunately, the injury proneness coming about. And that's why I've dropped him. As far as some of the other premium picks in the game, I've given Saka a rise. We will need to monitor the situation as to why he was tactically subbed versus Man City, because I don't think we actually got any sort of quotes from Arteta on why he was subbed, but I think it was tactical. So that's sort of my assumption. But unless we get some news on Saka, of course, I will leave an asterisk on him just to sort of make sure that we actually find out what exactly is going on with him. But for all intents and purposes, I hope he's totally fine and good to go for the next 2 amazing fixtures for Arsenal, which is Leicester at home and Southampton at home back-to-back. I still find that Salah, Palmer, Son are all elite picks. In fact, I'd like to even shout out Ben Crellin. His sort of recent FPL Wildcard 5 draft actually featured Palmer, Son, and Saka. So it kind of shows you that we are entering a landscape where some people are still willing to take the bet against Haaland, and it actually can work out. For example, I think Ben Crellin actually captained someone like Son, who actually got 10 points whilst Haaland got 9. But generally speaking, right, this is a run of games where your team structure will dictate how you're going to go about some of these green to yellow assets. I think it's totally fine to not have someone like Palmer. It's totally fine to not have someone like Son. It's also fine to actually just keep Salah for game week 6 and ignore Saka for game week 6 as well. So I just want to be clear that all these assets are fantastic, but the way that you structure them around your team and how you sort of maximize your team value is really up to you as a manager. Just be aware of how the captaincies lie, because when you actually own some of these elite players, What you do need to be thinking about mentally is, how am I going to navigate each game week through the captaincy? And is it plausible that, I don't have Haaland in the team, or I don't have Palmer in the team, or I don't have Son in the team? And things like that, I think, are very worth looking at. Moving on to the forwards now, we actually have João Pedro still at the top of the sort of 5.x tier. Now, I think João Pedro and his minutes are very much down to, let's say, Fabian Hürzeler's actually approach to sports science and injuries and things like that. I was quite shocked that João Pedro actually came off the bench, because I thought that either he would be risked in the sense that he could start, or he would be risked not at all, which means that he would have been out of the squad. It seems like at least the approach of Fabian is quite conservative. He always mentions that he doesn't want to take risks. So maybe João Pedro off the bench was something that he saw was totally fine, and something that maybe the medical team actually thought was more appropriate than, let's say, starting. So that's information that we have to learn, and I'll have to take that into account in the future. However, I think as long as João Pedro seems to be fit for the next game week, I really don't have any issues, I suppose, with his viability as an FPL pick. I still prefer him over Welbeck, even though Welbeck did really good within the Nottingham Forest game and also took a direct free kick and scored a goal there. So very, very impressive. But Strand Larsen, Vardy, Elvin Nilsson are all the picks that I think do follow closely after someone like João Pedro. I would like to say too that what I find a little bit tricky with this sort of price tier is that you probably don't actually want to go with any of these players unless you are choosing to, let's say, ignore a 4.5 forward to just sort of block up the 8th spot in your team, or you actually are trying to maximize around players at that 5 to 6 million price point, right? Because someone like Calvert-Lewin is actually incredible value right now, and I can understand people doubling up on these players, but the one concern is how many available substitutes that you have. Like, do you really want to go for Vardy, Welbeck, Strand Larsen, etc.? What I think is really nice is that Wood appears to be an elite option as well. So I feel like Wood is definitely someone who deserves the plaudits because he became the penalty taker finally. This was something that I was very concerned with in the past. I thought that Wood was actually someone who probably was going to take penalties, but you never knew if Morgan Gibbs-White would actually be able to sort of retain penalties. Because I think the last time Wood and Morgan Gibbs-White ever took a penalty on the same time was never. So we actually previously had Morgan Gibbs-White take the last Nottingham Forest penalty, and Wood has a really stellar penalty record, at least for the last few years, but he hasn't taken a penalty yet for Nottingham Forest. So the fact that he took a penalty with Morgan Gibbs-White on the field just really cements how much of a rise in expectations Wood has within my mind. He's also come over the two tough games, which is basically the Liverpool fixture and the Brighton fixture. So that's why Wood gets such a substantial rise. And definitely there's a huge boost in terms of my expectations for him due to the penalty share. With Duran, I just think that it really is close to a matter of time before Emery actually invites this man to play and start games for Aston Villa FC. One thing to mention too is that Aston Villa have been doing quite poorly, I would say, without, let's say, Duran coming off the pitch. So a lot of these games recently within the last few weeks have been tremendous comebacks, and Duran's on the field usually for a significant portion of those games. So I just have to imagine that with someone like McGinn out of the team and injured, that Duran's going to get much better minutes, and that's going to be very exciting. As far as someone like Wood, and let's say choosing between Duran, Calvert-Lewin, and Wood, I do think that Calvert-Lewin actually has the best run of games, so I do think that he's still the pick that I would go with for now. But if you are a huge gambler, I can understand wanting to go for Duran because he just simply looks like the best player on the field at all times, at this sort of price point outside of, let's say, João Pedro, arguably. So for me, I can understand why people have a huge FOMO or love for Duran. He just really looks like, at 20 years old, one of the most impressive players that I've seen. And that's that. With Cunha, great goal versus Aston Villa. Still a tough run of fixtures to go, but I'm sure he'll undoubtedly rise within the short term. At the 7.x range, what we have here is Solanke with a rise. And that's due to his minutes being much better. But also, actually, the most important thing coming out of that game is the quality of the performance versus Brentford. I think the game versus Brentford was actually the highest XG recorded for any team so far this season. So it actually shows that it was an extremely impressive offensive performance. Now, it also probably was equally an awful defensive performance from Brentford away from home. But I think the major question mark this season so far for a team like Spurs is not actually on defense, but rather on how stifled their offense has looked on certain games. And the fact that they actually played such a great complete game with Solanke playing really good minutes, even though he actually played, I think, around 90 minutes once again within the EFL Cup match, just shows you how important he is for the team, how many minutes he's going to play going forwards. And I do have some doubts in terms of penalties, right? I do think penalties are belonging to Son, but Solanke is still just an incredible value option. And even on a wildcard 6, I'm definitely considering to try get Solanke into my team. With Mateta and Jackson, we're starting to see that the minutes impacts have significance on some players, right? Mateta was a 45-minute substitution, so I feel like it's always hard to sort of foresee whenever he'll actually be a green pick because the minutes can be very dicey with him. With Jackson, he was subbed off at 63 minutes, but I feel like if you look at the substitution patterns compared to Palmer, yes, of course, they were subbed off at the same time, but more often than not this season, we've seen that Jackson has actually been an earlier substitute than someone like Palmer. So I don't think that Jackson is immediately someone that we can say will just cover Palmer. Yes, of course, he looked incredible. The underlying stats are absolutely there for Jackson. The one thing is, though, he is not a penalty taker. And I do think that whilst West Ham looked absolutely awful, how often is it that other teams will put such a poor performance on the table? I'm not quite sure. So Jackson obviously has been super impressive. I think a lot of people have even been alerted to the fact that he's probably scored more non-penalty goals than most of the other sort of leading options within this price range. But I still find it a little bit hard to take on the idea that he's better than some of the picks here that have penalties potentially that will play more minutes per game. So that is a little bit of context I think needs to be added to sort of the Jackson story for now. But he does get a rise this game week. I just think that people just need to temper their expectations a little bit. As far as Havertz, he gets a rise. Next two games are amazing. Back to center forward versus Man City, although we've seen that many, many times before. I do think with a couple sort of lack of squad players within the team that we might see something like Gabriel Jesus within the forward positions within some of the games over the next few games, and that can have an impact negatively on Havertz. But is he still an amazing pick as soon as game week 6 rolls around? Of course. And the same applies to Watkins and Haaland, who are definitely firmly within a lot of FPL managers and their minds already so far. So nothing really to say there. As far as defense, there haven't been too many changes this week, but I feel like the main shifts are, for example, the Nottingham Forest fixture shift. And I would say that I was actually highly considering adding Moreno to the cheat sheet, but then he actually got 45 minutes subbed off, which was really a bit of a shock because I thought that he was quite nailed and penciled into that left back position. What it seems to be the case is that Aina is very clearly the first choice right back of the team and probably the second choice left back of the team, which means that on most days, you can even arguably say that he could be first choice for both. And so that's very interesting news and very good in terms of the value of him compared to maybe some of the center backs of the team. So that's why Aina gets a massive rise. Colwell and Pinnock get rises as well. I think that generally speaking, when you're looking and shopping for some 4.5 options, there's a lot of options now, right? You've got players like Pinnock who've actually got West Ham at home. Colwell actually has Brighton at home, even Nottingham Forest at home game week 7. So generally the runs of games for these players are pretty decent for now. Pau Torres and Consta still very good because the run of games for Aston Villa is quite extended. And then Davis, we gave him a rise last week. And Lewis, I still think is interesting, right? He was benched for Arsenal, but I still think that there's a case to be made that he's someone who very clearly looks like the player within this sort of price point who will play very much like Zinchenko last season versus some of the easier teams that Man City get to face. Over the next few games, I can't see too many games where Lewis isn't someone who would be available to start. He clearly wasn't the comfortable option to play versus Arsenal, but I already mentioned that within the cheat sheet. I think a lot of credit goes to someone like Luke, who you can follow on Twitter, who gives extremely insightful Man City analysis when he chooses to do so on Twitter sometimes, but he's been very kind to sort of share some of this information with me. So I just feel very blessed by that. So I do think that Lewis over this run of games is still someone to absolutely consider, even if you're wildcarding, because these are the type of games where Lewis will play, and that's the case. As far as Milenkovic, he is added to the sheet because Nottingham Forest just seemed like a very, very impressive team. They did concede 2 goals to Brighton, but I also have to say that the quality of the chances that Brighton actually got versus Nottingham Forest were actually very poor. So Welbeck actually scored off of a direct free kick, and the header from Hinshelwood was actually just a world-class header. I think that when we talk about Nottingham Forest this season, their defense has been incredibly impressive, even whilst contextualizing the fixtures, and so that's why Milenkovic is here. He also, in my opinion, has a little bit more set-piece threat than Murillo, which is why I've added him, as opposed to Murillo. As far as Guecki, Van de Ven, Van Heck, Dunk, these are all players that I think are just a tier below. I do think that it's plausible that you actually go for someone like Dunk because Game Week 9 is an incredible game for Brighton. So when I suggested my wildcard draft for, I think, two days ago, a lot of people were questioning why I went for Dunk. But the reality is actually, when you look at Arsenal's run of games, Game Week 9 is a fixture that isn't exactly great for them because they play versus Liverpool. So one of the players that actually has, I think, a lot of extended long-term value is someone like Dunk, who actually has really good games after Game Week 10 or 11, and ultimately actually has a great fixture on Game Week 9 where he can definitely cover an Arsenal player. I know a lot of people go to watch someone like Gabriel or even, let's say, someone like Raya and say that Arsenal, are someone that you absolutely have to play even in the tough fixtures, but I generally do not think that that's the case. if Arsenal were to somehow perform better than they have so far over the course of the entire season, the sort of point tallies that we're talking about for some of these Arsenal defenders would be absolutely stratospheric. And I think they're definitely out of sort of proportion. So the reality is Arsenal will have some poor performances in the future, particularly when they're versus some of these weaker teams. I'm sure we'll see some clean sheet losses. I'm sure we'll see Gabriel not scoring a goal per game versus tough opponents and things like that. So we just need to temper our expectations a little bit. Arsenal defense, obviously absolutely elite, but just making a point here in terms of why some people might still want to cover a little bit of rotation in the future. Van Heck actually looked really good as well. Just an incredible pass towards Hinchelwood, but of course more credit towards the header. But clearly him and Dunk, I think, are quite nailed for Brighton. In the 5.0 tier, Konate and Dalot for me are still my favorite options. Dalot has gotten a rise. I think that ultimately a lot of people are going to say, you know, where's Mazraoui? And part of that is maybe just Shaw isn't ready to play professional football. I don't know when for Man United, but he will be somehow for the English national team. But Dalot is someone who's absolutely locked into both positions. I think when you look at even the B, it's very crucial to mention that he does a lot of actions in BPS that actually lead him to be a very strong FPL asset, even though he's much more expensive than Mazraoui. So I feel like when you're projecting the minutes going forwards and even sort of anticipating in the future any sort of rotation, Dalot is pretty much impervious to that, and why I quite like him as a pick compared to Mazraoui simply on that basis. De Ligt as well is super interesting, and I probably should have actually mentioned him, but De Ligt is someone who actually just looks like a massive set piece threat and someone that I do prefer over Mazraoui for the time being. As far as Munoz and Udogie, I do think they're a tier below some of these players because Udogie just has not been exciting whatsoever this season in open play, despite, let's say, Porro, his counterpart, being quite exciting as well. Munoz, I would also argue that unfortunately Crystal Palace just don't look like exactly the level of defense we might have expected from them at the start of the season, which is why he still is a yellow pick. And the run of games is still pretty middling. As far as the 5.5 tier, I've added Timber because of the sort of uncertainty around White, which also strengthens the sort of nailedness, I suppose, of someone like Timber. Now, Calafiori actually played really well within the Man City game. He obviously scored a screamer, which was arguably accidental, but I suppose the question is going to be in the future, is someone like Timber always nailed, or is it likely that we could still see an Arsenal lineup that might field something like Calafiori plus White in the future? So I still think that there's a little bit of doubt with Timber. I feel like Gabriel and Saliba's positions are not really in trouble because I think a lot of people were actually more concerned with, let's say, Timber impacting Gabriel's minutes, but with Gabriel playing so well, being so stellar, I think Gabriel and Saliba is here to stay for a long, long time, which is also why within the 6.0 tier, you see those rises for Saliba and also the knock-on fall for Van Dijk, just because of the run-on games for the next few 4 or 5 game weeks. Liverpool actually have a really good fixture string around game week 10, so that's probably when someone like Van Dijk will rise. With Konate, the reason why I still have him as a green pick is because he is still absurd value for what he represents as a Liverpool defender. So I feel like Robertson's probably the player that I would go with. Yes, we've seen Tsimikas in the Champions League, but him losing minutes is something that I don't really see for the foreseeable future within the league. There's a midweek match for Liverpool. I highly expect Tsimikas to play there, and then Robertson to continue playing at the turn of the weekend. And with White, there's a bit of an asterisk here and no rise, even though the Arsenal games are great, because I'm not really sure why he was benched versus Man City, but that already is an interesting sort of tidbit in terms of his minutes for this season. As far as the goalkeeper movements, I've given Onana a rise and Alisson Becker a fall. I'm not really sure if Alisson's back next game week, but ultimately, run of games for Liverpool slightly worse now. I think if I was definitely considering a wild card, some of the keepers that I would definitely be thinking about would be the likes of Murek to rotate with some of the other goalkeepers at a very sort of exclusive price point of 4.4. Otherwise, some of the other picks that are green here, I think are still very much interesting. With someone like Aston Villa, yes, they have lost a lot of clean sheets so far, but I would also say that their expected goals conceded have actually been very, very strong. And they look nowhere like the Aston Villa of last season, where they were actually just very comfortably a mid-table defense. So that's the early signs for now. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the cheat sheet. Take care and goodbye.